Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for Designing Procedural Justice, a conversation with Rachel Triska and Chief of Police Eddie Garcia. My name is Jessica Burnham, and I am the director of the MADI program, the Master of Arts in Design and Innovation. We are a program that's supported by both the Lyle School of Engineering and the Meadows School of the Arts. Our program teaches students from varying backgrounds our human-centered design process with a specific focus on social impact on a hyper-local level. We also aim to bridge the gap between academia and professional practice as much as we can. One way that we do this is through our Designer in Residence program. Each semester, we partner with a designer that has a much needed and unique experience that will help support our Design Studio Capstone class. For our project this past spring, we had the great opportunity to partner with the Dallas Police Department, specifically with Chief Lonzo Anderson and Chief Angela Shaw and their teams. Within this one course, we had 4 student groups that each sought to creatively, intentionally, and authentically answer the question, how might we improve procedural justice for the Dallas Police Department? We approached Rachel Triska, recently named Vice President of External Affairs at City Square, to be our designer in residence this spring because of her extensive experience with police reform, city activism, and community engagement. We're also lucky enough to have Chief Eddie Garcia with us today. He is the 30th police chief of the Dallas Police Department and is the first Latino to serve in this position in Dallas's 140 years of history. He places a tremendous value on public safety and community engagement with an understanding that it is a shared responsibility and that police cannot do it all alone. Our talk today stems from the expansive work that our studio students took on for their entire spring semester, but also aims to look to the future of policing with the city of Dallas. We're excited for this conversation today to show the value of partnership in action. And with that, I'll let Rachel get started. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy your time.
Thanks, Jess. Chief Garcia, it was so wonderful to get to know your team this semester and work with them, and I've been excited for us to have the opportunity to sit down today and have this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me.
For sure. Well, I have a few personal questions to start. Your first day on the job here was February 3rd, but you've been with the force in San Jose for 30 years before that. What led you into policing?
Oh, I applied to be a police officer when I was 20 and a half. I turned 21 in December of 1991, and I got hired right at the start of 92. And, you know, after nearly 30 years, I always reckon back to what got me into police work, and it was just the excitement of the job at 20 years old. And it's funny, as we'll talk about it, perceptions and things change through the years of law enforcement, but at that time, I really liked the excitement. I liked the fact that every day was different, and I wanted to help people. And I'll tell you this, as a young officer, I wanted to take the criminal element off the street, and that's why I became a police officer.
Yeah. Well, shifting gears a little bit, if I did my research correctly, you're a Peloton user. And I'm wondering today if you might want to share your username with the folks.
Well, I'll say this. I'm not going to share my username, but I will say this. You'll probably recognize the name if you know a little bit about me. Okay. And if you're riding in the early morning hours on a weekday, odds are on a 30 or 45 or even sometimes an hour ride, you'll find me.
Okay, friends, I tried. I want to come back to your work. You said that it was the excitement, the ability to make meaningful change by getting violent criminals off the streets that brought you into policing. What kept you in it? You said things shifted over the years, but this is a tough job. Why'd you stick with it?
The people. The people did. It's interesting because particularly with me, having been a major city chief, particularly last year and last summer when everything was when it was occurring, we saw a lot of chiefs leave the business. And there's a lot of us that stand for something, that stand for our communities, that stand to keep our community safe, that stand for our rank and file, that are honorable men and women that serve and do amazing work in this profession. And if all of us, called it quits, who's left to carry it on and move forward? Yes, we all make mistakes. There's no question about it. Particularly last year, we made mistakes. But the people keep becoming. The fact that we need our men and women, that continue to sacrifice for our communities. And unfortunately, not just locally, but nationally, we've seen the price that our men and women pay all too often. And also, we want to make sure that our community is treated fairly. We want to make sure those two ideologies and those two concepts are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And I appreciate that, and I recognize that. And so, to me, my community keeps me coming. The community, the work we can do, and the men and women that sacrifice. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah. I love hearing that it's the community that keeps you coming back, because the moniker is protect and serve. And so that is centered in the community. One of the concepts I came back to a lot as we were working with DPD and SMU this semester is one of aesthetic force. This is a concept developed by Dr. Sarah Lewis. And it is this idea that we have an image of what has been and a vision of what can be. And aesthetic force is what happens when we have this experience that says we can actually bridge that gap. And that moment moves us towards justice. And so Dr. Sarah Lewis describes that moment as the moment when we reconcile our past with our intended future selves. And procedural justice is a new concept in policing that is aimed at us being able to bridge the gap between what has been and places where we can move towards greater justice. And I'm curious if you've had an experience in your career of aesthetic force where you were moved with this picture of what has been and a vision of what could be, and you found yourself moving, and that movement was towards a more just way of being who you are.
Well, one of the, there's so many things and so many experiences that one can talk about in nearly 30 years of law enforcement.
Right.
But, I remember as a young officer being on a unit that was called the Narcotics Enforcement Team. And we did street-level narcotics back in San Jose. And back in the mid-'90s, particularly in the state of California, there were two differences. If you sold powder cocaine, you can have an opportunity to either get probation or go to county jail.
Right.
If you sold a rock of crack cocaine, odds are you were going to prison.
Right.
We'll get through this later because there's a lot of other things, but it wasn't, later on, through, and we know obviously, what crack cocaine impacted and what communities it impacted and where powder cocaine was centered.
Community of color versus white communities.
Of colors
Absolutely.
compared to others.
Right.
Yes. And years later, I had a great friendship with someone I really appreciate very much. His name was Pastor Jason Reynolds for Emmanuel Baptist in San Jose. Great leader, African American leader from Chicago that came to San Jose, and we struck off a very genuine friendship. And I remember talking to him. We talked about things, and we were open with each other, and we weren't afraid to talk about the issues. And one day he told me, he goes, Eddie, because I told him that exact same story, and he goes, Eddie, we were never saying that it shouldn't be wrong. We were just saying to make it the same.
Right.
And that resonated with me, so that we need to start thinking, that we could start thinking about thinking back and going, yeah, he's got a point. Why were they treated differently? Let me fast forward as to how that makes a difference in being a leader. And so as those things move forward, you start thinking the way things might affect different communities. And there was one example in a part of my city where it was a large population of immigrant, undocumented community in a certain part. And we were getting parking complaints in those neighborhoods. And the initial reaction was to have my officers go out and conduct parking control in those areas. And at first blush, you're like, what? Let's go and enforce parking. And then I took a step back, and I went, well, do we know can we stop for a second and think about this? We're in an area where there is a culture where there's going to be many families that are living together, because that's how they're making a living. That they're working extremely hard, and some are parking in those areas. Some might be parking blocks away. And so long as it's not causing a public safety issue, can we take a moment of pause to truly communicate this out in the proper language, and so that people understand. And those are just some things as we look at the broad brush of public safety on how it affects certain communities, and that as leaders, we need to be called on to not just be, go to the fridge and get the box.
Right.
We have to think outside that.
Well, what I love about what you're saying is it's a design issue, that you guys are being thoughtful, and you're sitting with this tension of we don't have to do it the way that we've always done it, that we can listen to the community, that we can lean in, that we can understand the language barriers and the things that we're facing. And I believe we can design for more just systems, and it sounds like you do as well. And that's the work that we got to do with you guys over this past semester. And I would love for us to talk some about that work, because our students focused on the question of how might we improve procedural justice within the Dallas Police Department. And I want to pause here for a minute, because you're the content expert. I could explain to everyone what procedural justice is, but I feel confident that you will do it far more justice. So can you tell me, how do you understand, how do you define procedural justice?
Well, one of the things about procedural justice is it's not some, this grand concept. It's a very basic concept, and it really revolves around fairness, and people treating people fairly, about being transparent as an organization to the extent that you can. It's about giving people a voice and to be impartial in the decision-making process. Yeah. Those are just some the basic tenets that, as I was coming through a procedural justice class, is just giving people a voice and making them feel that they're being treated fairly.
Yeah, and I come from a community organizing perspective, so I came with a bias to this project of thinking we were going to focus on external procedural justice, that we were really going to look at those 4 things from the perspective of what's the police relationship to the community and the impacts of when we see those pillars at work versus when we don't. But the student research really led us into areas of internal procedural justice. And that was a different experience for me, to understand more the challenges that you're facing within the department around those 4 areas and how that plays out. And so our student projects ended up involving your public information office and helping create a development plan for that, and professional standards for community engagement, and reminding officers and encouraging them of this is the experience we want people in Dallas to have when you're engaging with them, and recommendations even on your procedural justice training, and getting to see how that's delivered and how that could be delivered better. And we even rolled out a prototype for employee resource groups, and we were looking at how can we provide some more peer-to-peer support for your officers, because there's a lot of occupational stress that they're facing, particularly in a year like what we've had, where we're also looking at a worldwide pandemic. So of that work, the projects that this team's had, which ones aligned, or what one aligned most with your team's plans for improving procedural justice within the Dallas Police Department?
Well, let me preface what I'll say with the fact that in order for an organization to practice procedural justice outside of it, it has to occur inside of it. Yeah. And so that is the basic premise and principle of procedural justice, having it to exist inside first. I would say one, from a press information perspective, is important, because I know our officers, and the amazing work they do, they want to tell their story.
Yeah.
They want to show that, we're not just out. Yes, are we out we have a weed and seed mentality in the Dallas Police Department. We're going to weed the criminal element off our streets, but we're going to seed those same areas with positivity. And all of our stories aren't about weeding. They're about seeding. They're about giving supplies to a school that's near one of our areas of concern. It's about negotiating and working with some nonprofits to get a community center, a projector. So it's those type of stories that we need to work with the community so that they can see us in a different light. And then the other piece, I would say, is the wellness perspective that you said towards the end.
Yeah.
That's incredibly important. And honestly, it's not just simply because of the pandemic and what we've been in, although that has been extremely stressful. But it's the everyday occurrences that our men and women face every day. That oftentimes they see things in a day that some people may never see in their lives.
Right. I know it was impacting for our students when they did the ride-alongs with the officers, and they saw just the pace of the work and going from one call to the next, and it was impacting to see the typical daily stress that a lot of these officers have, that just part of the job.
Absolutely. And it's important. It's eye-opening, and at the same time, that causes trauma within all of us.
Yeah.
Now, in law enforcement, we tend to internalize a lot of things, and so we need to be better as an organization, to be proactive, to really get help to our officers, to at least have it available to them when they need it.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. Yeah. Well, Chief Anderson and Chief Shaw were enthusiastic partners. We loved working with them. They were wonderful. And something I appreciate about you as a chief that I've seen is that I've noticed this pattern that you enjoy partnering with academic institutions. So if there was one space that you could continue to partner with academic institutions here in Dallas, and not limited to SMU, we've got lots of great entities here, what would it be? What is the thought partnership that you would value the most?
You know, I think particularly in public safety and law enforcement, there's issues that come up every year, different issues, different things. You know, I know that we developed a history of policing class in my old department that we worked, and that was something that was very important at that time. And as you look back, you think and go, why wouldn't we do that a long time ago?
Right.
And so the things that I'd love to partner with, and again, you know, if you read, you know, the basics of the 21st century policing, is for law enforcement agencies to partner with institutions of higher learning, you know, to continue the education of our officers. Is something that I'd love to partner with our institutions, no question about it. A well-educated police department is a more professional police department. I mean, there have been studies that have shown that. And so that's an area that I'd like to partner more with, is to get more of my officers the opportunity to engage in getting their degrees or you know, broadening their experiences.
Right.
And I think that's something that's very important.
And you mentioned the work that you did in San Jose, which is something I wanted us to talk about today, because you partnered with San Jose State on this policing history course, and it was required, as I understand it, it was required for all academy graduates. And I believe you guys gave 6 sessions to it, which I think was impressive in terms of the amount of training and time that you were offering for that particular course. And I believe it was entitled Policing and the Current Political and Social Climate. So my first question for you is, what led you to implement this program?
It's a great question. I think it was one evening, you know, probably 4 years ago or so now. I remember watching the movie The 13th on Netflix.
Yes.
And it was a Friday, and I watched the movie The 13th on Netflix, and I remember texting my buddies, you know, that I worked with in the community, and going, and some hadn't even seen it.
Yeah.
And
which, if you have not watched it, we highly recommend it. Chief and I both recommend it to you right now.
Now, I'll say this, and I say this for credibility. There's some things I agree with. There's some things I don't.
Right.
Not everyone who law enforcement arrests is innocent. But there were some other facets in from a historical perspective that I did not know.
Yeah.
That I was embarrassed that I didn't know.
Right.
It was years later that I saw another movie, LA 92. If anyone, that's another Netflix movie, LA 92, that talks about the Rodney King riots, or in the protests that occurred after that. The interesting thing about that one is very equal, is that both those, you know, those that particularly in LA 92, that incident was based on a history of systemic issues that are occurring in the city.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that got me is I started when I was 21 years old.
Right.
And, you know, I would go to some communities in my city where it might be a community of color in one of our, you know, areas of concern and need, that would be, what do you know, why are you harassing us? Why are you doing this? You know, expletives, you know, and this and that and the other. You'd go to another community that was maybe more affluent, wasn't a community of color, that it was yes sir, no sir, how can I help you sir? So as a 21-year-old, you walk away from those situations and you ask yourself, why does one group treat me in a way where I may feel disrespected, where another group does not? And after I saw the movie The 13th, I said, there's a reason for this. This didn't just happen.
Yeah.
And we need to recognize as law enforcement that this badge that we wear so proudly today didn't always shine so bright, and that there is a reason in our communities and in our cities that there is a distrust. Now, it's not something that can't be overcome. It absolutely can. But we need to acknowledge so that we can move forward. And it was powerful. It was a powerful message. Yes, every recruit had to go through it. And the recruits, I'm a big history guy. I love history. I think the recruits enjoyed it. It wasn't just the class. After the class, we would have community meetings with students and have conversations. And it just was extremely well received. I was very proud of that project.
Yeah, and Chief Anderson told me that you would be excited for me to ask the following question. I hope he's right. Are there any plans for an equivalent program here in Dallas?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think one of my goals when I was in California is I thought it should have been a post-certified class. I think it's something that every licensing group of every state needs to have a class that I know it's what it's called, but it's really the negative aspects of American law enforcement and how we got here in some communities.
Yeah.
And as I started off, we can talk about that negative past while still praising the amazing work of the men and women that sacrifice every day.
Right.
You can have that space. You could talk about both. It's not about one or the other.
Yeah.
But it's very important to talk from a historical perspective in this country and then drill it down into the specific issues that occur in the cities that you're in to understand your communities better. And I've found oftentimes that, that has, for lack of a better term, that's disarmed oftentimes communities of color when I'm speaking to them, and we admit it. Yeah, we've done some pretty brutal things, and we continue to have done. We're our own worst enemy at times. We have to acknowledge that in order to be able to really claim that. I mean, that we have men and women that are amazing, that will sacrifice for their communities, and it's very important for us to have that knowledge.
Yeah. Originally, my next question was going to be, what piece of Dallas history did you hope that all of our officers would know? But on July 24th, you apologized for one of those aspects of history that was really brutal. And that was what I hoped you would bring up whenever I was going to ask you the question, was the death of Santos Rodriguez. And for people who aren't from Dallas or maybe don't know the story, Santos Rodriguez and his brother David, 12 and 13 years old, were pulled out of their home for alleged petty theft. They were taken into custody without a warrant, put in the back of a patrol car, and in an effort to coerce a confession, the officers used Russian roulette as an intimidation tactic and shot Santos and killed him in front of his brother. And that was in 1973. And on July 24th at the community memorial, you chose to, and were the first police chief to apologize to the Rodriguez family for what happened. And you apologized not only personally, but you said that this was on behalf of every officer who wears the uniform. And I appreciate so much you taking that step of being willing to talk about these places where we really got it wrong. And that every officer in Dallas not only now knows that story, but they know the posture that the DPD is going to hold around that, and that's one of sorrow and remorse. And so thank you for taking that step and leading in that way. I'd like to ask, when we're talking about history, is DPD doing the work of truth, healing, and reconciliation on a broader scale? Is there consideration of where else these kinds of amends need to be made? Is that a conversation that's happening? Because trust, that kind of building of trust, is a huge part of procedural justice.
Absolutely. I mean, here's, one of the dynamics, particularly coming from, when you talk about the issues that occurred in a lot of American cities last summer, and then having the pandemic, was the inability to go out and talk. When not having that ability to just talk and to break down barriers was a significant hurdle, particularly to those of us, and I know there's a lot of us out in my profession that are chiefs that really wanted to do that needed to do that. And so we need to continue to work to go out to our communities. We need to look where our blind spots are as police departments, transparency, use of force, equity in the way we enforce our laws. And we really need to take a deep internal look at how we do that, recognizing and understanding that we have a community to keep safe.
Yeah.
And that we have an important job to do. And always, I always say to myself, if I haven't thought of something new in a month, and I do my best work at home, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm at home on the weekend, if I haven't thought of something in a month of something new to do, there's something wrong. Mm-hmm. And so, this, as the late Arthur Ashe used to say, success is a journey, not a destination. And the doing is more important than the actual outcome, because we're never going to get to the finish line. We know we always have to keep working hard and finding those blind spots, working with our community to make us better as a profession, knowing we have an important job to do, and knowing that we know our communities do not want us to go away is important for us.
You know, as I've worked with criminal justice reform over the years, something particular, I mean, historically and in the present, when I think about one of the issues I find incredibly challenging for police officers is I see this double bind that happens, where we have officers who are sworn to uphold the law, and then at times that law has been unjust. I mean, we could talk about Jim Crow and the Black Codes, and you've already mentioned the 1980s and the war on drugs and stop and frisk, and the list just goes on and on. But we have officers who are sworn to uphold racially biased laws. And that's a challenge, and it's a frustration that some of your officers expressed around this kind of legislation. They told us, there's no one that's making the legislators take courses on procedural justice. They're not taking courses on implicit bias, and that has a downstream effect for policing. And so what, if any, role do police departments and police unions have in identifying and speaking out when you see racially biased legislation at work or in the works?
So, the way I'll answer that, I'll say we need to get involved on the front end.
Yeah.
There is nobody that's closer to our communities than our men and women that are here, right? And so, I said this, I would say the same thing in California, is that, the legislators at the Capitol in Sacramento weren't speaking to community and neighborhoods in San Jose to know what was affecting. We want what's best for our communities. We want to be fair, and we want to make sure they're safe. And we do want to take that violent criminal element off our streets. Bring us to the table so that we can come up together. We want the same goals, and that's a point that I would like to say, is that we ask. I know I speak for every colleague I have, not just in the state of Texas, but as part of the Major City Chiefs Association in the country. Bring us to the table so that we can work collectively together. I'm not a stay-in-the-office kind of chief. I've spoken to my community, and I will continue to do so, and we can bring a perspective that could be helpful, and that we can work to find that balance between safety and fairness, as long as we get brought in at the front end.
Yeah. On April 20th of this year, you released a memo changing procedures around how low-level marijuana offenses are handled in the city of Dallas, because you saw the data. And the data showed that there was an overwhelming racial bias in how arrests were being made. I believe it was 91% of people being charged were Black and brown. And side note, I was so thrilled whenever you released that memo, because I was part of the coalition of community leaders who worked back in 2017 to get that ordinance changed so that officers had the option of whether to charge and to offer cite and release. So here's my question for you. Is DPD now tracking data that can make it more proactive in responding when it's not legislation necessarily, but it's procedures where we're seeing racial bias being enacted by the force? Are you guys tracking that in a way that will help you be more proactive moving forward so that you can continue to make these kinds of changes?
Well, we are tracking that. We're tracking data. There's no question about it. But oftentimes we track the data, and sometimes we track data just to ensure that we're not doing something that's inappropriate, right? That there are reasons for why it is we do what we do. Certainly, with the marijuana issue, there is a disparity. But in addition to the disparity as well is, in this land of resources that we have, our officers need to be concentrating on violent crime. Not on low-level marijuana possession.
Right.
And one of the dynamics that I see is the fact that, necessarily arresting someone that has a joint I come from the state of California, okay? And you're not going to tell me that smoking a joint is necessarily going to lead to violent crime.
Yeah.
Because in California, we couldn't arrest people for marijuana since the 90s. So a difficult time to talk me into that argument. And it's interesting, as we have our violent crime plan, that we've seen our violent incidents actually reduce in these last few months as we've had this policy in place, is proof of that.
Yeah, I've read your plan, and it's very well researched. I love how data-driven it is.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, confession time for me. Don't worry, it's nothing too bad.
I thought you were going to say confession time for me.
No, for me. When Jessica asked me to be the designer in residence for this project, I told her that I did not think that we could ask the police to fix what's wrong with policing. And my previous line of questioning may suggest that I am more open to that possibility than I was at the end of 2020 when Jessica and I had that conversation. And over the course of the semester, I've experienced this tension between kind of the two options we talk about a lot when it comes to police reform. And on the one side, we have the movement that calls for a complete reimagining of what public safety is and how it's delivered. And on the other side is more what you and I have been discussing some today of what does self-correction look like within the police department, where it really is an internally motivated possibility. And when I think about this second option, in my experience, it feels a little bit like the theory that we have in racial equity work, that white people are responsible for fixing systemic racism because it's a system that we created. And when I think about this issue, I wonder if there's the possibility that that same theory applies here, that police officers are responsible for fixing the places where we're seeing a lack of justice or being a major part of that, because we created the system.
Well, you know what I'd say about that, I mean, law enforcement officers have a very difficult job. I think if we go back to that last question you had about getting in front of things and getting involved on the front end on how to do things, I think that's a way to correct where we're going. You know, I'll say that our responsibility is to ensure everything we're talking about from leadership perspective, that we put everything into context to figure out the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, and in some certain things to understand how it affects certain parts of our community, always with the backdrop of ensuring public safety. And it's not an easy answer, but it's something that we have to weigh that. And again, we have laws. We have laws in this country, we have laws in the state. There are laws that we have to enforce. Getting involved on the front end is the best way to be able to redirect or correct maybe some procedurally unjust laws that we may have.
There's this interesting concept in psychology that suggests for adults that the only people who can hold an individual accountable is themselves. You know, no one else can hold an adult accountable. And sometimes I wonder with these kind of systems if that's what we need, is that within the legislature and within the criminal justice system, if where we most need accountability is for it to come from within and for it to be proactive in the ways that you're talking about. So for people who are listening and self-correction doesn't even seem possible, this is like pie in the sky dream, what do you think the people who are calling for a complete reimagining of public safety are getting right? And there's a funding part to this. We've talked about that. You were in budget meetings today. So if you want to speak to that piece as well.
Well, you know, what I'll say is this, is that we do too much as law enforcement. You know, one of the things that I'm very proud of, that we're proud of here, is our Right Care program that deals with response to our mentally ill. In incidents where we may have officers responding, now we also have a medic and we have a clinician that responds to those, and we're able to double that because of our budget this year, which is fantastic. And so those type of things we're getting right. The one part that we need to reconcile is, and I'll say this very honestly, and I mentioned before, I'm not a stay in the office kind of chief, but I have not yet met a neighborhood impacted by crime in the city of Dallas that, regardless of racial makeup, language spoken, or economic status, wants us to go away and doesn't want us there. They want us to treat them fairly, there's no question about it, but they don't want us to go away. You know, yes, do we need to invest in our communities? Absolutely. Do we know that long-term safety in our neighborhoods really revolves around getting rid of poverty, getting rid of unemployment, better education, food deserts, mental illness, the family structure? Do we know all those things? Absolutely, they're important. But we have people that are dying now, people that are getting killed and shot and injured now. And so although those efforts will manifest themselves and they're important down the line, we also need to reinvest on that front end to keep our communities safe in a fair and impartial manner.
Yeah, I feel such a tension as I hear you speaking about that, because I understand the safety element and I understand the element of all the other things that you're talking about, of poverty as a driver of crime. And, you know, we live in a world where the zip code that someone is born into, it dictates so much of the life that they're going to live. And so in a city like Dallas, it's a zero-sum game when we come to the budget. And so I think that funding piece is so challenging of where we invest so that the police aren't doing too much. And so that we're really moving in lockstep across all of these areas. And I think that's so much of what I want to see is that investment in our communities.
Yes, absolutely. But investment in our communities, I truly believe, is both. Investing in the communities and investing on the guardians that need to keep them safe as well.
Yeah. For people who are listening today who are feeling slightly more hopeful about this possibility of the self-correction you've been describing, what are the metrics that we should be looking for here in the city of Dallas?
Well, I think one of the things that we're going to be doing in the city of Dallas is we're going to be transparent in our use of force. So our community use of force is the most polarizing issue in American law enforcement. And so we're going to look at our force, and we'll be able to see that if there are disparities in the manner in which we use force. And then we're going to be able to utilize those as metrics for us moving the needle. Use of force complaints and seeing how that happens. Complaints in general. And see how everything we're doing from de-escalation, procedural justice, bias-based policing, history, a law enforcement class, how is it affecting what we're doing? I mean, ultimately, in the end, there's going to be those realities and perceptions. And, a lot of the things that we do is ensure that when we're talking to our residents that, they speak positively about our men and women. That's extremely important. But from a metrics perspective, is really based on data on, no longer can we simply have success if we drive crime rates down, but community trust drops as well.
Right.
True success is crime dropping, community trust rising. Mm-hmm. That's what our goal is here. And there'll be ways to really to gauge that. As a matter of fact, I have a meeting with people tomorrow about a way of how we can get that in real time. Mm-hmm. Because here's the thing: is we have to get into neighborhoods. One of the things that we got to get away from, I think, is really having a global perspective of globally, asking, 1 million residents what they feel. We need to drill down into neighborhoods because number one, we will find that our neighborhoods want us there and they appreciate us there. And then number two, if there are things wrong, we need to get down to the micro level to figure out how we can fix those issues. And so we need to find mechanisms that are fair to both the community and the honorable men and women that wear this uniform in order for us to move the needle there. But we will definitely do that. We will definitely be moving in that direction. And
if people in neighborhoods want to engage you, if they're interested in sharing their experiences, how do they contact you? How do they contact the department?
They can contact, number one, depending on what station they live in, they can contact their major, their deputy chief. They can go on our website. They can send me an email. They can send my chief of staff an email. It's all on the DPD website. And again, working particularly with Chief Shaw as well in community affairs, we'll go out. We'll have those conversations. Yeah. Again, those conversations are imperative. They're very important to us, and we need to continue to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we started with this idea of reconciling our past with our future intended self. And I want to end with a future-directed question. In order for the Dallas Police Department to be recognized as a just institution, to be known for being procedurally just, what must be true moving forward?
We need to be able to look in the mirror. Each one of us needs to look in the mirror and say to themselves that they did everything they could for their community, that they treated their community fairly, and also did their jobs. And we'll be judged in the end by the transparency that we have, by making this city safer, is a way we'll be judged by. But again, as I mentioned earlier, both have to go hand in hand. And so the fact that we're out doing, as I mentioned earlier, success is a journey, not the destination. As long as you see these men and women, myself, my leadership team, out in the community trying and doing and reaching out, we don't believe in checking boxes here. I certainly don't believe in checking boxes here. So everything we do, there's a reasoning for it, and you'll continue to see us out there. And so we are a department that our community will trust. Will we make mistakes? Absolutely. But judge us as to how we deal with those mistakes once we make them. Because we are an imperfect profession. We hire from the human race. and we'll deal with that. And I think it's important for our community to know that our officers are striving to do the best we can for this community, and they'll continue to sacrifice for this community regardless the standard by which we're held. Our officers, our men and women, will rise to that level of expectation. Yeah. I've been thoroughly impressed by them, and we will do that for the city.
Well, I'm very grateful that we had the opportunity to sit down today and have this conversation. Chief, since you have been in Dallas, you have showed up and you have made yourself available to citizens in such a transparent and open way that I find just really stunning. So thank you for that. And thank you for that openness with our community today. It's been a joy to be here with you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to turn it back over to the brilliance behind this operation, Jessica Burnham, who's the director of our MADI program, and she's going to close us out this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Rachel, for just your great conversation and questions. And Chief, thank you so much for your time and just opening up and being so candid and just open with us in this conversation. And thank you so much for all of our viewers today for joining us. We will be posting the live recording on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending out a recap of everything after we wrap up. So if you have any questions about the project that the students have done this last semester or anything else about our program here at SMU, the Master of Arts in Design and Innovation, you can find us at www.smu.edu/MADI. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye.